Wyatt Holloway married the woman the whole of Cedar Gap called an old maid for one cold reason only: to keep the ranch his father's will would otherwise have taken from him. He did not expect, anywhere in that hard bargain, to have the heart he'd sealed shut years before quietly pried open again by the very woman he'd wed for convenience. The trouble began with the will. Old Asa Holloway had been a hard, far-seeing man, and he had died believing, not without cause, that his only son was on a road to wasting the ranch he'd spent his life building. Wyatt was 38, unmarried, and grown bitter and solitary in a way that worried his father to the grave. So, Asa had written a clause into his will, the kind of clause a stubborn old man writes when he thinks he knows better than his son how to save him. The Holloway Ranch would pass to Wyatt only if Wyatt was a married man within 1 year of his father's death. Fail that, and the whole spread, the deeded land, the water rights, the brand, would go instead to Asa's nephew Royce Pell, a slick, grasping man down in the territory capital who had never sat a horse he didn't have to, and who would sell the Holloway ground to the first land company that waved money at him. Wyatt had 11 months to find a wife or lose everything. And Wyatt Holloway had not the slightest intention of ever loving a woman again. There was a reason for that, and her name had been Lavinia Crew. Years back, when Wyatt was young and open and whole, he had loved her with the whole-hearted foolishness of a man who has never been hurt, had courted her a full year, had a ring, had a date set. And 3 weeks before the wedding, Lavinia had thrown him over for a flour merchant out of Denver with twice the money and a fine brick house. And she had done it publicly, laughing, in front of the whole of Cedar Gap, calling Wyatt a dirt-poor cowboy who'd never amount to anything. The humiliation had gone into him like a splinter into the bone, and it had festered there for years, and it had turned a warm young man into the cold, walled-off one his father died grieving over. So when the will left him needing a wife and not a heart, Wyatt did the most Wyatt thing imaginable. He went looking not for love, which he was done with forever, but for an arrangement. He found it in Prudence Ashby. Prue was 36 and the closest thing Cedar Gap had to an institution of pity. She had been a bright, pretty girl once, folks dimly remembered, but her mother had taken a wasting illness when Prue was 18, and Prue, the only child, the dutiful one, had given the next 18 years of her life to nursing her, turning away what few suitors came until they stopped coming, watching her own youth spend itself out at a sickbed. When her mother finally died that spring, Prue emerged blinking into a world that had moved on without her. 36, unmarried, penniless, the small house mortgaged to pay the doctors, facing a future as a charity boarder shuttled between distant cousins who didn't want her. The town called her an old maid, and not kindly, and looked through her the way people look through a thing they've decided has no further use. What the town did not see, what no one had bothered to see in 18 years, was that Prudence Ashby was the cleverest person in Cedar Gap. All those years at her mother's bedside, she had read everything she could get, had kept the household's accounts to the last penny because there were no pennies to spare, had taught herself ledgers and figures and the management of a poorhouse run on nothing. She had a mind like a steel trap and a spine to match, and she had simply never, in all her dutiful life, been given one single thing to use them on. Wyatt came to her with his proposal blunt and cold, because cold was all he had. "I need a wife inside the year or I lose my ranch," he said, sitting in her near-empty parlor with his hat on his knee. "I'm not offering you love, ma'am. I haven't got any to offer, and I won't pretend otherwise. I'm offering you a roof, your own room, security, and respect, a fair partnership and an honest name. You'd be saving my ranch. I'd be saving you from being passed around your cousins like an unwanted parcel. I figure that's an even trade between two people the world's got no other use for." It was the rudest, most unromantic proposal a woman ever received. And Prudence Ashby, who had spent 18 years being told she was a burden, found something almost bracing in being offered at last a fair and honest bargain instead of pity. "I won't pretend to feelings I don't have either, Mr. Holloway," she said, just as plain. "But I'll tell you this. If I take your name, I'll earn my place in it. I don't know how to be ornamental. I only know how to be useful. If that suits you, we have a deal." They were married in the Cedar Gap Church on a gray Tuesday with 2 witnesses and no flowers, and the town clucked that the cold cowboy had married the old maid to beat his father's will, and felt very clever for having figured it out, and thought that was the end of the story. It was barely the beginning. Because within a month of moving into the Holloway house, Prudence Holloway had quietly looked at the ranch's books, which Wyatt kept the way a drowning man keeps a diary, and discovered that the failing ranch was not failing for want of cattle or grass or labor. It was failing for want of a brain. Wyatt was a fine hand and a poor businessman. He was being cheated by a freight contractor, underpriced by the buyer at the railhead, and bleeding money through a dozen small leaks no one had ever sat down and added up. Prue added them up. She did it without being asked, at the kitchen table by lamplight, the way she'd kept her mother's accounts, and one evening she set a single sheet of figures in front of her startled husband and showed him, in her neat, clear hand, exactly where the Holloway ranch was dying and exactly how to stop it. Wyatt stared at the page a long time. "You did all this," he said slowly, "in a month." "I had 18 years of practice running a house on nothing," Prue said. "A ranch is only a bigger house with more debts. You've been losing money you don't have to lose. Give me the books and a free hand, and I'll have this place in the black inside a year." She paused and added with the first dry flicker of something like humor he'd seen in her, "It seems I'm useful after all, Mr. Holloway. Imagine that." He gave her the books. It was the first thing he had trusted to another living soul in years. And the ranch began to turn. Prue renegotiated the freight contract and fired the contractor who'd been skimming. She found a better buyer 2 towns over. She brought order to the chaos, and money started to stay in the Holloway accounts instead of leaking out of them. And the hands, who had braced for a useless town wife putting on airs, found instead a woman who knew the price of everything and the worth of every man's work, and they came to respect her with the deep, grudging respect cowboys reserve for competence. But it was not the ranch that undid Wyatt Holloway. It was the small things. It was the way Prue never once, in all his coldness, was cold back to him, was simply steady and fair and kind in the plain, unsentimental way of a person who has decided that bitterness is a luxury she can't afford. It was the way she set his coffee just how he liked it without comment, and mended the things he broke, and asked nothing of his sealed heart while quietly, by her mere daily presence, reminding him that not everyone in the world was Lavinia Crew. He had married her sure that all women were vanity and betrayal underneath. He woke one morning, months in, and realized he had been wrong about that for years, that the proof had been sitting across his breakfast table all along, asking nothing, giving everything, expecting no thanks. The test came in the autumn, and it came wearing Lavinia Crew's face. She came back to Cedar Gap a widow, the Denver flour merchant having died and left her less than she'd hoped, and she heard that dirt-poor Wyatt Holloway had inherited the biggest ranch in the county and turned it prosperous, and she came calling, beautiful as ever, full of sweet regret, hinting that perhaps she had been hasty all those years ago. Perhaps a clever woman could see her mistake, and a generous man could forgive it. She found Wyatt mending tack in the yard, and turns the full warmth of herself upon him, and the old splinter in his bone gave one last twist. And Wyatt Holloway looked at the beautiful woman who had broken him, and then he looked past her, to the house, where through the window he could see his plain, clever, faithful wife bent over the ranch books that were keeping a roof over all their heads, the woman who had never once lied to him, never once made him feel small, never asked for a thing she hadn't earned. "You're too late, Lavinia," he said, and was surprised to find there was no anger left in it at all, only a kind of peace. "By about a year, and by about a wife. I married the woman this town calls an old maid because I needed to save my ranch. Turns out she saved a good deal more than that." He set down the tack. "She mended something you broke a long time ago, and she did it without even trying, which is more than you ever managed even when you were trying your hardest. Good day." And he left Lavinia Crew standing in the yard and walked into the house and stood in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at his wife in the lamplight, Seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. Prue looked up from the books. Was that? Nobody that matters, Wyatt said. He crossed the room and pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, close, the way he never had. Prue, I married you for the ranch. I told you that plain and I meant it, and it was a cold, poor thing to offer a woman, and you took it anyway because the world had given you nothing better. He swallowed. I have to tell you something now, and I'm out of practice at saying true things, so bear with me. Somewhere in these months, between the books and the coffee and you never once being cruel to a man who half deserved it, you fixed something in me I'd given up for ruined. I don't want a wife of convenience anymore. I want you. The real thing if you'll have a slow fool who took this long to see what was sitting at his own table. Prudence Holloway, who had spent 36 years being looked through, set down her pen with a hand that was not quite steady. I told you at the start I don't know how to pretend feelings I don't have, she said softly. So you should know. I stopped pretending I didn't have them for you some while ago, Wyatt. I just never expected you'd come round to noticing. People generally don't. Her eyes were bright. Yes, the real thing. If you're sure you can want a clever old maid more than a beautiful liar. I'm sure, Wyatt said, of nothing in my life so much as that. The will was satisfied, and the ranch was theirs, and Royce Pell got nothing, and Cedar Gap took a long while to understand that the marriage it had clucked over as a cold convenience had turned, somewhere along the way, into the truest love match in the county. They built a good long life on that ground, Wyatt and Prue. He the hand that worked it, she the mind that kept it, the two of them partners in the full, deep sense of a word most marriages only borrow. And in their old age, when a young man of the family once asked Wyatt how he'd known, with all the beauties in the territory, to choose the plain, clever woman the town had written off, old Wyatt Holloway only smiled and reached over and took his wife's ink-stained hand. Son, he said, the world spends all its time looking at the pretty parcel and never once asking what's inside. I near made that mistake myself, and it would have cost me everything. The right one isn't the one the town can't stop looking at. It's the one who, when nobody's watching and there's nothing in it for her, keeps the book straight and the coffee hot and the faith you don't deserve. He squeezed her hand. I married her to save a ranch. She saved a whole man instead. Don't ever overlook an old maid, boy. The town's leftovers are sometimes the only treasure in the room.